Grenada is a small island country in the Caribbean that was first sighted by Christopher Columbus on his third voyage to the Americas. It was not settled until 1650 when it came under French control. It was then ceded to the British in 1763 and remained under British control until it was granted an independence in 1974. The first Prime Minister of Grenada was Eric Gary, who established a parliamentary government. Shortly after it gained independence, the new government was overthrown by socialist rebels who quickly aligned themselves with Communist Cuba and the Soviet Union. After a second, more radical revolution in 1983, the United States made the decision to invade the island, claiming it was a Soviet outpost. But the invasion was highly unpopular internationally, which resulted in many countries condemning the United States and demanding that it leave Grenada alone. Which leads us to the question: to what extent did the international community's protest affect the compromises that the United States made with Grenada after the conflict that resulted in U.S. control of the island?
The invasion of Grenada. Communism stops here.
In 1979, just 5 years after gaining independence, the government of Grenada was overthrown by the New Jewel movement, a group led by Maurice Bishop that sought to push a moderate socialist agenda that was minimally influenced by Karl Marx and the USSR in an almost bloodless coup. After this revolution, the island of Grenada seemed to do well, but the new regime started to oppress the population. For example, they censored the news, had political prisoners, and had no free elections, which had been promised. The USSR also started supporting the island, which resulted in Grenada receiving supplies and aid from them. However, some inhabitants of the island wanted to become fully communist and ally themselves with the USSR. This led to a second coup, which happened in 1983, which was a very radical and bloody coup in which members of the previous government were arrested and killed. The United States blamed Cuba and the Soviet Union for the Second Grenadian Revolution, but they both denied these allegations. The United States had not liked the old regime that had arisen in Grenada after the first coup, but after the more radical second coup, they seriously began considering military action against Grenada. Reasons why the United States wanted to invade Grenada included that the United States saw Grenada as a bad example for other poor Caribbean states, and believed that if it did not remove the communist leadership from Grenada, other islands could also ally themselves with the USSR. The United States had also recently suffered a loss in Vietnam, and they were pressured to win something, and invading a small island like Grenada would be an easy victory for the United States. Additionally, President Reagan claimed that several other Caribbean states had asked for American assistance.
Last weekend, I was awakened in the early morning hours and told that 6 members of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, joined by Jamaica and Barbados, had sent an urgent request that we join them in a military operation to restore order and democracy to Grenada.
On October 25, 1983, the invasion of Grenada began. The United States' main objectives on the first day were to capture both of the airports and the university campuses that contained American students. The United States successfully captured Pearl's airport and attempted to secure the radio station, but met heavy resistance. On that same day, the United States freed political prisoners and deployed airstrikes against Fort Rupert and Fort Frederick. On the second day of the invasion, the United States freed another university campus and freed 233 U.S. students. By the third day, most organized resistance had dissipated, and the United States took control of the island. Throughout the invasion, nearly 8,000 U.S. soldiers and 353 Caribbean allies participated. The U.S. forces sustained 19 killed and 116 wounded. The Cuban forces sustained 25 killed, 59 wounded, and 638 captured. The Grenadian forces sustained 45 dead and 358 wounded, and at least 24 civilians were killed. In short, the invasion was a quick and easy victory for the United States. Although the invasion of Grenada might have been quick and easy for the United States military, it was a much more difficult affair for the inhabitants of the island. The inhabitants of the island were highly polarized on the subject of both the initial idea of the invasion and the decision that the United States made during the occupation of the island.
Some people saw the U.S. invasion at least as a way of ending the fear, and restoring a kind of political order to the island. But there were also other people who were extremely angry and dismayed that Grenada was being invaded by a foreign country, and that this was a violation of UN conventions.
In order to satisfy both the island's inhabitants who thought poorly of the United States and those who thought the United States had breached international law, the United States decided to implement policies to allow Grenada to govern itself. This included the planning of free elections and the creation of a new government run by previous Grenadian political figures that approved of the United States. To govern Grenada until the elections, the United States instituted a temporary advisory council.
The Governor General of Grenada worked together with the U.S. government to form an advisory council, and this was a council that would begin serving from the beginning of November, so at the end of the invasion when the U.S. was still present, but when there wasn't, fighting was over. This was an advisory council made up of Grenadian political figures and who were chosen to help govern the island in this interim moment.
The United States government did more to ensure that Grenada would become an ally than just allow for free elections and set up a new government. They also allowed for extensive advertising of American goods and services on the island, believing that if Grenadians participated in America's capitalist economy, they would favor it over the USSR's communism. Additionally, they covered the island with American propaganda, showcasing how successful the recovery efforts were on the island. The invasion had broad popular support in the United States, including support from Congress. There was a mixed reaction from United States students on the island about this, but the United States allowed these students to continue their education in the United States. Also, the Goldwater-Nichols Act, which reduced the power that the United States president had on sending troops to another country, was passed. This act was designed to reduce the likelihood of another similar invasion like Grenada, as the international reaction to the invasion was negative. Although it may appear that U.S. policies shifted away from international intervention, the invasion still had broad bipartisan support from both the public and politicians. In stark contrast to the domestic response, the international community's outlook of the American invasion of Grenada was largely negative. The United Nations Security Council attempted to pass a resolution that, quote, deeply deplored the armed intervention in Grenada, quote, reaffirmed the inalienable right of Grenada to freely determine its own political, economic, and social system, and, quote, called for an immediate cessation of the armed intervention and the immediate withdrawal of the foreign troops from Grenada, unquote. This resolution would have passed as it had 11 votes in its favor, but it was vetoed by the United States. The other three countries that abstained from the vote were Britain, Togo, and Zaire. Although the resolution had failed to pass, it still was successful in practice because it forced the United States into vetoing a resolution condemning it, which effectively condemned it regardless. Also, an identical resolution was passed with over 100 votes in the General Assembly approximately a month later. A major area of concern after the invasion had been that the United States' European allies would distrust the U.S. after the invasion, which could have led to the possible expansion of communism in Europe. However, after the U.S. agreed to compromise with Grenada and allow for free elections, European criticism of the invasion began to soften. Before Operation Urgent Fury and the invasion of Grenada, it had seemed that the United States was desperate to secure a victory in the Cold War. Weakened by the recent defeat in Vietnam and the disaster that the intervention in Lebanon's civil war had become, where almost 300 Marines were killed in a suicide bomb attack on their barracks, the United States was looking increasingly weak and out of control, and to many of the United States allies it seemed that the United States should stop engaging in all these useless Cold War conflicts. Operation Urgent Fury brought these issues to the forefront once again. While the invasion was a military success that did reaffirm the United States' power, the international community condemned the United States for igniting another seemingly useless Cold War conflict. The international community's repeated condemnations resulted in a drastic decline in Cold War confrontations that the United States was involved in, and finally the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union was dissolved on December 26, 1991. Although it may seem like the United States, the world's greatest superpower at the time, wouldn't have to make compromises with the tiny island of Grenada after the invasion, the international community forced the United States to make various compromises with Grenada in order to maintain its international prestige. This limiting of a superpower's dominance by the international community shows that even the strongest of nations cannot bend other countries to their will without the international community standing up. Thank you to Professor Irwin and Professor Lambert for interviewing with us, to Mr. Kaler, our history teacher, for his support and guidance throughout the project, and to the judges and volunteers at the National History Day competition for taking the time out of their day to support our education and provide this excellent opportunity for all students.